All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Katie Earle. I'm the coordinator of the University Express program, and I work for the Erie County Department of Senior Services. And we're joined here with Cynthia Schwartz from Roswell Park. Super excited to have her and listen to this talk about Dr. Roswell Park. I know that there will be a lot of great facts for us all to learn here today. So before we get started, some quick housekeeping. You heard that I am recording, so I'll try to post this on our website in the near future. And for those of us who are new today, just so you know, you've done nothing wrong with our settings. So you are muted and without your video showing. And that's not because of anything you did, that's just our settings. So no worry there. And as you've heard, we also have other people here with us today. It's just that Cynthia and I are the only people who can see the complete list of attendees. So as Cynthia goes through her class, feel free to write any questions or comments you have in our Q&A panel. And we might break a couple times throughout her presentation or just have all questions at the end, depending on what comments we have coming through. And if you have any personal stories to share or any connections to Roswell Park, we would love for you to share those if you feel comfortable doing so. So we hope you have some fun with us here today. And how to access your Q&A panel, if you're new, chances are when you joined, it popped up on the right-hand side of your WebEx screen. You may just have to expand that. You'll see your text box, and then send that to me. If it's not up right now, if you look in the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen, you'll see a square with a question mark and Q&A. You can click on that. Or if you're on a tablet or smartphone, poke or touch your screen. That'll bring up your control panel. You'll see a circle with 3 dots. Click on your Q&A, and there you are. So I'd like to thank the sponsors of our program, which is my Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for everything they do to help make the program possible. And do not hesitate to contact us at Senior Services if you have questions about programs, services, or benefits for yourself or a loved one. We're happy to help however we can. We're 858-8526. All right, I'm going to introduce Cynthia now. Ms. Schwartz began her career at Roswell Park in 1980 and has served in a number of capacities, including Vice President for Government Affairs and Executive Director of the Office of Corporate Projects and Strategic Initiatives. In her semi-retirement, she was recruited back to Roswell by the Alliance Foundation to assist with their community outreach initiatives. She is an active member of the Western New York community, serving as Vice Chair for the Buffalo Planning Board. She is a member of the Board of Directors of the Buffalo Museum of Science, founding trustee and former secretary of the board of the Health Sciences Charter High School, and a member of both the Lancaster Square Advisory Committee and Elmwood Commons Advisory Committee. She recently joined the Advisory Council of Blue Cardinal, which is an investment and development company, and her and her husband are avid eco-travelers and have visited all 7 continents, and they proudly declare to all who will listen that they are Buffalonians by choice. In Buffalo, we are over 70 degrees today. Nobody would believe it. Cynthia, thank you for being here. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Katie. And I'm impressed that anybody is on their computer on this absolutely gorgeous Indian summer afternoon. I want to be outdoors. So, but thank you all for joining me today. I hope you'll find a bit of background on Dr. Roswell Park of interest, and I encourage you to send your questions to Katie as questions come up or you have anecdotes to share. I'm more than happy to be interrupted as I go through this, but what I want to do is introduce you to a man. Let me see which of my, oh, come on, here we go. Who really was a remarkable man for his time. He truly was a Renaissance man. Those of you who know that Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center is named after him know that he was a physician with a major interest in the problems surrounding cancer treatment. But he was also a teacher, a scientist, a musician, an author, a civic leader. There's not a whole lot that Roswell Park didn't do in his lifetime. But I want to give you a little bit of background on where he came from, because it really helps to define why he was such an erudite individual. He was born in Pomfret, Connecticut in 1852. Pomfret's a little town in sort of northern Connecticut. His father was the Reverend Dr. Roswell Park, who was the Episcopal clergyman. But prior to becoming a clergyman, he was a graduate of West Point. He was in the Army Corps of Engineers. He was a professor of chemistry and natural philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. And he held not one, but 2 master's degrees, a bachelor's, and a doctor of divinity. So Roswell Park was raised in a family with a deep commitment to community service and to education. His mother was no slouch. Mary Brewster Baldwin goes way back. The Brewsters are among the founding families off the Mayflower. Her father was a civil engineer who helped establish the Boston Naval Yard. So this is really a remarkable family for its time. He had 4 siblings, Mary, Clara, Ellen, and Baldwin. But this was a household that was going to be visited with a lot of sadness. Clara died at just 8 months old, and her mother took this very badly. She was having a very hard time dealing with it. So the Reverend Dr. Park had an opportunity to be the founding president at Racine College in Wisconsin, and he picked up the family and moved to Wisconsin. Just 2 years later, in 1854, Mary died, the mother, died in childbirth. She gave birth to Baldwin. 8 days later, she died. And in one of those oddities of this time in history, he was baptized at her funeral, which I find very odd, but that's what happened. Believe it or not, just a year later, Helen and Baldwin, Helen was 7, Baldwin was a year, died within 4 days of each other. So the Reverend Dr. Park was now a widower with a teenage daughter. Mary had just turned 13. And Dr. Park, Dr. Roswell Park, who was at that point just 2.5. Because he was so young and because Mary was really too young to take over mother's duties, little Roswell Park at age 2.5 was sent back to Pomfret to live with an uncle who was a country physician. And the years that he spent with him clearly were formative for him as a young man. In 1860, his father remarried, and at age 9, Roz was sent off to Racine, Wisconsin, to a father he barely knew and a stepmother he knew not at all. It had to be, I would think, a pretty traumatic event, but he loved helping his father set up chemistry classes at the college. So he became his dad's sort of teaching assistant at a very young age, just sucked up science education especially, graduated with a baccalaureate in 1872 and a master's in 1875, and then went on to Northwestern Medical School in Chicago. What's really unusual about this is he entered medical school extraordinarily well prepared compared to the average medical student of the day. Many would start medical school right out of high school. Some might have 2 years of the equivalent of college. Ross arrived on the scene as a young man who also was already extraordinarily well trained. He graduated at the head of his class from Northwestern at the age of 24, and immediately was recognized in Chicago for his skills. So he was appointed to the faculty of the Women's College and a lecturer at the medical school. Think about this again, at the age of 24. He married Martha Prudence Durkee in 1880, and he was just an incurable romantic because their delayed honeymoon was a summer European tour where they visited all of the noted surgeons and research laboratories that he could gain access to. When they returned, he was immediately appointed a lecturer at Rush Medical School and an attending surgeon at Michael Reese Hospital. One of the things he was noted for was his willingness to accept and explore new ideas, and he promptly adopted Lister's theory of antisepsis. These were the years when, if you were a practicing surgeon and you were going to prove your worth was how much blood was on your coat at the end of the day. You didn't wash your hands, you didn't change your lab coat in between surgeries. You sort of wore proof positive that you had been in the surgical theater all day. The fact that this young buck was pushing the older members of the faculty on the theory of germs and infection, and encouraging them to wash their hands, to change their clothes between surgeries, to change surgical drapes on patients, was actually considered quite radical. He built a real reputation for himself very quickly in Chicago, and in 1883, he was asked by the University of Buffalo Medical School to come to Buffalo and become chair of the Department of Surgery. He was only 31 years old. He was considered a little bit of a radical. He was a bit of a progressive. And I love this quote from the Buffalo Medical Journal. "We fail to ascertain, after repeated inquiries in surgical circles, that the new appointee brings to this responsible position any very extensive experience or reputation. Have we not local talent without sending to Chicago for aid?" The old-timers were very unhappy about this appointment, but the leadership at the medical school knew that he was exactly what they needed to build a medical school that was going to have a national reputation. He first lived at 305 Delaware with his wife. 305 Delaware is now a parking lot next to the M&T tech headquarters on Delaware. But they bought a home at 510 Delaware where he would raise his family and where his initial practice would take place. This house is no longer there. It is, you all know it because you drive by the site on a daily basis if you come downtown. It is currently the site of the Best Western Hotel. He did establish a secondary office after his practice grew a little bit down the street at 430 Delaware. That's the building that's directly across the street from the mansion on Delaware. That is the old Victorian house with sort of the modern front on it. It's now apartments. The house became an absolute center of attention in the community. He loved teaching and his students loved him. And there's a quote from one of his students that Dr. Roswell Park was an ornament to his profession. I love that. I'd love to be an ornament to my profession. His two children were born there, Roswell Park III and Julian. Julian went on to a distinguished career at UB in English and history. Roswell Park became a stockbroker. It will get a little confusing because there were 7 Roswell Parks in the family lineage, but only 4 of them carried a junior or a third or a fourth. So try not to stay ahead of that because it gets very confusing. He set up practice with Dr. Ed McGuire. They were lifelong friends. There was a falling out that took place at some point not long before Dr. Park died that I only became aware of recently. A letter was shared with me by a descendant of Dr. McGuire, and clearly there was a rift that took place, and I need to find out what that rift was all about. But it's a pleading letter from Dr. Park for Dr. McGuire to tell him what Dr. Park has done to so offend him, and if they can't mend the rift, they'll have to separate company after many years of practicing together. Great mystery. Got to figure that one out. We need to remember that Buffalo was a boomtown at this stage of the game, 8th largest city in the United States. For a while there, we had more millionaires per capita than any other place. This was a growing, booming source of lumber and grain and transshipment. People were making an enormous amount of money. And one of my favorite things is this Heinz 57. I had no idea that the logo and the label went back quite that far. During this time, people were moving out of the city. Now, we think of the city as a much larger entity, but the reason that North Street is it was the northern boundary of the city during this decade. So once you crossed North Street, you were in the country. And therefore, Delaware Avenue became a very attractive spot. for people to demonstrate their wealth and build their mansions. Many of these houses still exist. Unfortunately, many of them are also gone. I particularly like this interior piece because between the poor bear and all of the bric-a-brac and the plants, I'm happy I'm not the one who's dusting and cleaning in that house, but it's a fairly typical interior view of one of the Delaware Avenue mansions. Dr. Park was a prolific writer, and these are just a few of the areas that he wrote about. And it was everything from, bones and joints to breast disease to syphilis to the use of electric and surgery. But his two big items were antisepsis, which we just talked about, pushing the fact that germs do cause infections and you can control infections with proper care, and the treatment of gunshot wounds. And for some of you who already know some of the history of Roswell Park, you know that that comes back to have a big play later on in his life. He had a fair amount of experience with gunshot wounds while he was doing an internship at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. He also had a lifelong interest in the treatment of epilepsy. He was the first in the country to pinpoint and operate on a precise location on the cerebral cortex, a lesion on the brain, that was causing partial motor epilepsy in a patient, and he cured the patient. These were not days when much surgery was done on the brain, much less to try and cure a disease like epilepsy. He became the attending surgeon at what was called the Craig Colony, which was founded by Dr. William Letchworth. This was 1,900 acres of a former Shaker colony just outside of Letchworth area, Mount Morris. It was one of only two in the country that was supported by state government. And this was a time when there was a theory with a lot of diseases that if you just got people out in the country with fresh air and good food, you could cure their problems. It sort of worked for tuberculosis. It wasn't much of a cure for epilepsy, but this was an operation that ran into the 1940s in its configuration as a residence for epileptics, and had a number of other uses over the years. It is now closed. He had a very strong feeling that if you were going to go into medicine, you should know something about the history of medicine. Up to that time, you sort of trailed around another doctor. You saw what he did. He shared his experience with you, and voila, you were a physician. So when he joined the faculty at the university, one of the things he insisted on was teaching the history of medicine, starting back with the Greeks and Romans, so that his students would have a concept of how ideas had evolved over time. He always wanted them to think about the next possibility, not just doing the same routine thing. He also, during this time period, performed surgery on the youngest child, just 23 months old, who survived a nephrectomy, a removal of a diseased kidney. There was almost no part of the body that he didn't seem comfortable going into and exploring. He built such a large reputation for himself that he was wooed back to Chicago with a fairly enormous, generous offer that would have made him a wealthy man and very powerful. Had he taken this job, which he was seriously considering, he would have had control of surgery at the Rush College and Presbyterian and all of the private practice attached to that. So he would have been a very wealthy, powerful man in medicine in Chicago. But he really loved Buffalo. He really loved teaching, and I think he saw potential. However, the civic leaders in town were not so sure that he wouldn't be tempted away. So when he did his trip to Chicago for his interview, along with him went Dr. Charles Carey, one of the leaders at the medical school, to make sure if a really nice offer came about that he would do everything he could to counter that offer. Park chose to stay in Buffalo to the dismay of the New York Times, who covered all of this. This was big news nationally. They could not believe that he was willing to stay in, backwoods Buffalo, in their view, rather than going on to Chicago. But he was a clever guy, and he made it clear to the leaders in town that there were some changes that were going to need to be made to keep him happy and keep him here. And it was one of the many initiatives he undertook to improve medical training and medical care in the city. Around this same time, excuse me, he operated on a young child who had diphtheria. Other surgeons would not touch the child because diphtheria, of course, was highly contagious. And they had absolutely no inclination to operate on this child's trachea to help them breathe. But of course, Roswell Park couldn't resist. He did the surgery. Apparently, during the surgery, a bit of blood or fluid got into his eye, and he did contract diphtheria, and he became seriously ill. He recovered. You will find news articles from the time talking about the fact that he's near death and the city is in mourning, but he did manage to recover. But the damage from the diphtheria, he had stenosis of the esophagus, which made it hard for him to breathe and swallow, as well as some heart damage, did catch up to him in his later years. So the deal he struck was that he wanted a medical palazzo to be built for his research and for patients. So in March of 1893, voila, his medical palazzo arrived, and it was built by none other than George Carey, who some of you may know, famous Buffalo architect who designed and built the Buffalo History Museum, the Pierce Arrow plant on Elmwood Avenue, some of the Buffalo General buildings that are still remaining. So the two brothers were sort of the dynamic duo. Now, this was primarily research laboratory and outpatient facilities. And, oh, by the way, it is roughly on the site of where the new Children's Hospital is today, at the corner of Ellicott and High Street. He was very concerned as he saw a growing presence of cancer among his patients. Some of you may be old enough to remember the days that people wouldn't even say the word cancer. I grew up in a household where it was either whispered or it was called the Big C, because there was a belief at that time that cancer was caused by venereal disease, by weak genes, by poor sanitation. So families were ashamed to admit that a member of the family had cancer. It was always something else. But he could see that the numbers were growing. And of course, the numbers are growing because the city was growing with the steel plants and the foundries and the grain mills and operations that just de facto in their day were a source of cancer. And his frustration was that, in his view, nothing ever progressed in medicine or science unless people of differing backgrounds and expertise came together. So he proposed in 1897 a research laboratory just for the study of cancer. And it would be closely aligned with Buffalo General, where he could get fresh tissue and blood samples. They approached the state of New York, Dr. Park and community leaders, and they were rebuffed. Governor Black at that time turned them down, saying that this was not the role of government, that this should be privately funded. They were discouraged, but not defeated. So in 1898, Edward Butler, who was the editor and publisher of the Buffalo News, marshaled the forces of the civic leaders, and they went after the state again. And this time they got $10,000 appropriated for a 3-room laboratory in the medical school to be called the New York State Pathological Laboratory. It will come as no surprise in the environment we're in right now, but one of the things that helped push this forward is that this time Governor Black was up for re-election, and it became to his benefit to keep the wealthy people in Western New York happy and fund this laboratory. I'm going to do one little side bit here because many of you will recognize this building. Almost everybody refers to it as the Butler Mansion, and it was owned for many, many years by the Butlers. However, it was built by George Williams. He wanted to have a house in the most prestigious corner of the city. So this is right as you leave the city and are headed into the country, looking downtown, all 22,000 square feet of it, because of course you had to have room for the servants. He was deeply involved with the Pan Am exhibition. And when it was clear that the exhibition was going to close and have a huge loss, a combination of really bad summer weather and obviously the assassination, he took all of the money that was on the site, got it home, contacted his other friends who had been investors, distributed the money among them, and left town, which meant all of the workers, all of the vendors, everybody else who was owed money from the exhibition was left holding the bag. Shortly after that, Edward Butler bought this mansion, which at the death of his daughter, Kate, was given to Roswell Park. And we then sold it to, of course we did. We then sold it to, God, sorry, I'm drawing a blank. The tractor manufacturer out of Canada, who bought it from us many years ago. It is now owned by UB and has several high-tech companies in it. In 1899, just really 2 years after Dr. Park had really started pushing for a concentrated effort, he was being recognized by the AMA as having the only laboratory for the exclusive study of cancer and tumors in general, supported by the state of New York. That's important because once he established this, he also wanted to make sure that his model could be done elsewhere. And the other medical schools were, again, recognizing that this was a really unique event that was taking place in science and medicine here in Buffalo. So the push was on for now a dedicated laboratory because he had outgrown his 3 rooms over at Buffalo General. And the local community wanted to, again, support him. About $3 million was raised among the larger community to purchase a site of land and to start the construction. And it was pushed to completion by Mrs. Ratwick, whose husband had been cared for by Dr. Roswell Park. She wanted to do what she could to help move it along. So her $25,000 gift then is about the equivalent of $1 million today. And she was able to take the funding over the top so that the laboratory could be built. And this is the laboratory that Mrs. Ratwick and the citizens of Buffalo made possible. The only thing, and one of the things I love about this, if you look at this closely, this is Dr. Park's office. And I want you to notice that, of course, there was a cigar and cigarette stand sitting here next to the armchair. A relatively simple office, but it looks as though it's fairly comfortable. And of course, was right next to the laboratory, which was important to him. The only part of this celebration that had a sad aspect to it is that not long before the building was dedicated, his wife Martha was off visiting friends in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Became a little ill. Nobody was terribly concerned about it. But over a period of 3 weeks, she grew weaker and weaker, and she died on November 14th, 1899 at age 42, and like his father before him, left him a widower with 2 young children to raise. At that point, his children were ages 9 and 11. His sister Mary moved to Buffalo to help him care for the boys while he continued his practice. And life became really interesting for him in 1901 with the Pan Am exhibition. For those of you familiar with downtown, this is roughly, sadly, where the Skagit Route 33 runs today. Here's the historical building that George Carey designed and built. You'll see the Albright Knox down here. It was supposed to be open for the exposition, but they did not finish it in time. And it, of course, was the biggest thing that had happened in Buffalo ever, bar none, beats even the Erie Canal. And the city was agog over this. It was the universal decision on the part of the community leaders that Dr. Roswell Park should be the medical director. And it was a very expansive role. He was not just designing and operating the hospital and clinics, but he was also basically the veterinarian. He was responsible for all the sanitation. So all the bathrooms, all the sewers, all the water, the food vendors, and even some of the animals on the ground. The story is that there was an elephant that was on display that somehow stepped on a spike that went into its foot, and it was Dr. Roswell Park who removed the spike. He had asked for 2 electric ambulances and was promised 2. He got 1. And here is Dr. Park right here with his staff. And it's interesting because the aides and nurses were not just from Buffalo. It was very prestigious to be a medical professional who was selected to be part of the staff at the hospital that summer. So these folks came from around the country. And of course, McKinley was going to visit. This is the headline of September 4th, 1901. It was an exciting time in the city, but I can't leave this without bringing this to your attention about the brides who will be married in the lion's den, 4 couples who will be united, surrounded by wild beasts. There were a lot of strange and wonderful promotions that took place at the fair, and that has got to be one of the stranger ones. The next day, on the 5th, everybody was crowding the grounds because it was going to be their chance to see the president. If you notice this armored train, if you can see it on whatever tool you're using right now, the Boer War was going on. So this was an armored train with Brits who were killed in South Africa during the Boer War. This is the day of September 5th. McKinley was giving his speech. I love not only the clarity, these are fabulous photos when you consider they're 120 years old. This is the press pool, because of course he had no microphone. So the press sat directly beneath him on the podium so that they could hear what he said. And the crowd was enormous. I don't know if his voice was able to boom out over the crowd or not, but it was huge. And of course, if you were one of the ladies of the ladies committee, you got to sit up on the dais with the president. Here he is giving his speech. As you can see, he's a well-fed gentleman, and that proved to be a huge problem for him shortly after this photo was taken, because he was doing a 10-minute meet and greet. He claimed he could shake 50 hands in a minute. So he was planning to have 500 people come through, shake his hand, move on, and then he was going on to a special dinner. Zoglitz, who was an anarchist from Cleveland, managed to be in the receiving line. And the reason the handkerchief that he has on his hand didn't draw any special attention was because it was a blistering hot day. And most of the men and women had a handkerchief or something in their hand, just, sort of dabbing their face. So nobody particularly noticed the handkerchief that was hiding the gun. Zoglitz got off 2 shots. And the gentleman behind him is the sort of the untold story, or at least has been for many years. It's being told now. That's Big Jim Parker. He was working at the one of the concessions. He was in line to meet the president. He had been a sheriff for a little while down south, and he was the one who grabbed Zoglitz and wrestled him to the ground so he couldn't get off a 3rd shot. The gentlemen around him were theoretically there as guards, but there was no official Secret Service. They were initially high praise for Jim Parker, but it doesn't take long. It's only a matter of a couple of days when you read the newspaper reports that he begins to just disappear. Because, of course, he was an African American who had rescued, they felt, the president, and the men who were theoretically there to protect the president were able to do nothing. It's really interesting as you read the newspaper stories how Jim Parker is there, he disappears, and then it's the equivalent of the Secret Service who were, rallying to the cause. People are becoming aware now of Jim Parker's story, and it's long overdue. He was a real hero. They should have taken the president directly to Buffalo General, but they decided instead that they needed to do surgery immediately. So they took him to the hospital on the grounds. Roswell Park was in Niagara Falls operating on a patient and could not leave. He was in the middle of an operation, but they had called him to let him know a special train was on the way to bring him to Buffalo as soon as he was done with the surgery. The special train never showed up, so he had to wait on a train platform in Niagara Falls to catch the local train. By the time he got to the fairgrounds, they were closing up the wound. The irony of the story is that on display at the fairgrounds was the first X-ray machine, but nobody thought about bringing it into the operating suite to see if it could be used. It was known as the City of Lights. The electric lights were everywhere, thousands and thousands and thousands of 8-watt bulbs lighting up the grounds. In the operating room, there was one 8-watt bulb, and the sun was setting. So they took a silver tray to bounce sunlight from the setting sun onto the operating field so the doctors could see what they were doing. Dr. Mann, who was a gynecologist, was selected to do the surgery. He did a perfectly fine job. There's been lots of talk over the years that, he was familiar with the wrong gender and the wrong part of the body. He did a perfectly fine job on the surgery. They did not put a drain in. Dr. Park was critical of that, but critical in the background. These were days when physicians did not publicly criticize or second guess each other. He wanted to have the president taken to Buffalo General, where he felt there were the best facilities to care for him. But the decision was made instead to take him to the Milbourne House on Delaware Avenue. This house is now the parking lot for Canisius High School. The Milbournes moved out of the house and turned the entire house over to the president, his wife, and the entourage, and the doctors for his convalescence. And initially, everybody was pretty optimistic that there was going to be a recovery. It was a problem because he was shot in the abdomen, and as you saw from the photo, he had a pretty abundant abdomen, so it was hard for the physicians to get through the surgeons to get through the layers of fat. But they were pretty optimistic that things were going well. Now, these were definitely the days before HIPAA, because everything, and I do mean everything about the president's care, was detailed virtually hour by hour. How much urine he passed, whether he had a bowel movement, what he ate, his temperature. I mean, there was no privacy for this man whatsoever. And the newspapers covered it in detail. Roswell Park was selected to be his physician of record and gave the daily briefing. So this is Roz in, as you can see, a horse-drawn carriage. There he is briefing the press. We're standing next to an electric car. Interesting dichotomy there. One of the problems that quickly became evident was that the poor man had terrible gas buildup, and they were attributing that to the fact that he wasn't moving his bowels. He had terrible gas buildup because, of course, he had a massive infection sort of nestled behind the pancreas, and the poor guy was just bloating with infection. But the newspapers, did the day by day. Dr. McBurney, who was the DC physician, who everybody loved to hate. He was determined to be front and center at all times, even when he didn't have the most current information. And there was a fair amount of back and forth among the various physicians. By the end, there had to be 6 or 7 primary positions and some lingerers around the edges. And the poor man finally gave up the ghost on September 14th. And the city went into mourning, and the Pan Am exhibition went into bankruptcy, basically. But this was not the be-all and end-all of Roswell Park's life and career. He always felt that this was, you know, a momentous time in his life, and he always was rueful of the fact that he wasn't front and center for when the assassination took place. Not long afterwards, a distraught woman here in Buffalo shot herself in the stomach, pretty much duplicating the wound that the president had had. She shot herself twice. The trajectory was identical. She was half the size of the president. Roswell Park operated on her successfully, and she survived. Now, whether you can really tie those two, obviously, is open to question, but it's one of those stories that goes along with it. By 1904, Roswell Park was not only involved in a huge number of civic and statewide things, but he also was beginning to feel the after effects of his bout with diphtheria and the number of medical crises he had had since that time. And they were really beginning to take their toll. Nevertheless, you can see the laundry list here of where he served as president or was a leader. He was appointed a brigade surgeon in the National Guard. He was among the first surgeons commissioned in the U.S. Army Reserve. He was appointed to the Board of Visitors at West Point by President Roosevelt, obviously his father's alma mater. So his career and trajectory of impressive accomplishments continued. In 1908, they decided that they would honor his 25 years in Buffalo and his contributions to medicine. They held a dinner at the Iroquois Hotel. What a wonderful building that is. That's roughly where M&T Bank and Plaza are today. But I will read this to you because it may be hard for you to see on your screen, but I want to share with you the very light meal that these gentlemen had. They started with cocktails and caviar, and then they had sherry and oysters, followed by consommé with spring vegetables. Then they took a breather, and they had sauterne wine with crab a la Newburgh. They had sweetbreads, just my favorite thing for those of you not familiar. That's calf, thymus, and pancreas in a cream sauce, followed by sorbet with Benedictine liqueur and a pause for cigarettes. And then they went on to dinner. Dinner was duck l'orange with potato souffle, asparagus, prunes glacées, petit pours, cheeses, accompanied by whiskey, champagne, and they threw in mineral water just for the heck of it, black coffee, and of course, a round of cigars at the end. This was not an evening that women were welcome to attend. I don't know how they waddled out of the Iroquois Hotel at the end of this, but it was a major event in town, and people came from across the country to praise Roswell Park and all that he had done for the community. This is a photo of Roz at 57. As you can see, he is showing at this point of this game the impact of the many illnesses he was able to survive. He was appointed Surgeon-in-Chief of Buffalo General. He's the first and only person who held that office. In 1911, he worked with Dr. Gaylord to get out of the cycle of every year going and begging for money. He and Dr. Gaylord thought it would be so much better if the state took over the institute, because then they would have steady funding. We could have a chat with him about how well that worked out. And they renamed it the New York Institute for the Study of Malignant Disease, and he received a lifetime appointment as chair of the board. And the last thing that he was able to see come to fruition was his ultimate goal, which was to have education, science, and treatment all taking place in a single location and all singularly devoted to cancer. So the 30-bed cancer hospital was dedicated in 1913, and he finally had fulfilled his dream of what we know today as a comprehensive cancer center. By this time, he was telling some of his colleagues that he was spending, typical Roswell Park, very precise, as much as 1/7 of each day working from bed because he was just too fatigued to get up and go into his office. So his partner, Dr. McGuire, was pleading with him to slow down. And Dr. Park's response, which one of his favorite quotes was, "Destiny reserves for us repose enough." And barely 6 months after the hospital opened, he died on February 14th at the age of 62. I know this is not a great photograph, but this is Dr. Park at age 62, and you can see he is not a well man. He has really aged. Well, he had given a lecture at the university that morning, came home, worked on a paper, went to bed, got up around 2 o'clock in the morning, felt faint, dropped on the bathroom floor, calling out to Julian, who was home, and in 20 minutes he was dead, undoubtedly of a massive heart attack. Ironically, 2 days after he died, the publisher of the Buffalo Medical Journal received a note from him asking that he be relieved of some of his committee work. Within 2 or 3 days, I hope to get away for a much needed rest of somewhat indefinite length. It had to be one of those ironic moments as this publisher opened up this envelope. When he died, he had a 3,000 book library, which he donated to the medical school. And it comprised at that time 25% of the total collection of the medical library. His services were held at Trinity Church. At his death, his model, done here in Buffalo through the extraordinary support of the community, he had served as a model for 12 similar centers across the United States and 8 abroad. So 20 comprehensive cancer centers over the course of his lifetime, all modeled on his work. And I love this description of him from Dr. Charles Stockton, who was a very close friend and on the faculty at the medical school. Vigorous, handsome, highly trained, possessed with the traditions of learning, a pervading sense of humor, the air of distinction, a skilled musician, a witty and brilliant conversationalist, a notorious mixer with men, it is not extraordinary that he quickly formed an extensive acquaintance among the foremost wherever he went, and many of the acquaintances became permanent friends. Above all, he loved life, humane activities, accomplishment. Knowledge, art, and technique he sought, pathology first, the clinic next, and practice last, outline briefly his method in relation to surgical study. But he was not limited to professional aims. He applied corresponding principles in acquiring an astonishingly varied learning in all directions. His men loved him. I would have loved to have met him. He had to be just a fascinating human being. His legacy today is what you all know as Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center. We now have 2 satellite clinics. We have 11 regional affiliates across the state. You can see the numbers there. Our patients last year came from 44 states and 5 foreign countries. We have major research programs. You've been hearing more about that during this COVID period, the work that we're doing with immunotherapies and vaccines. We have 5 major research programs, about $90 million in funded research, biotech spin-offs, international collaborations, and something that would be of special interest to Roz, my friend Roz. is that we have high school, college, graduate, and doctoral programs that serve about 1,300 students each year. Education, he believed, was the core of moving science and medicine forward, and I know he'd be proud of the depth of our educational programs. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. That was a wonderful presentation. We have a couple questions that we can jump right into and some comments too. So the first comment I'm seeing is Dr. Roswell Park was such a pioneer. So glad he was in Buffalo. Then we have.
As are we.
Glad he stayed. Never heard about Jim Parker before. Thank you for mentioning him.
He's got an extraordinary story. There's more about him available now, so if you wanted to Google him, he's a really interesting man who has an interesting story, and he just sort of disappeared from history.
Interesting. Okay. Next thing is, did his children go into the medical field?
Not a one. So Julian was an academic, he was the dean of the Arts and Letters program at UB for many years. His brother, Roz III, was a stockbroker and lawyer downtown. He had no children. Roswell Park IV, this is where it gets confusing. Some of you may be aware, died very recently. So his great-grandson, sorry, was an educator at Buff State, a longtime supporter of Roswell Park, and a 4-time survivor of cancers. Roz went through 2 bone marrow transplants and died recently within the last few months. So he's the end of the line. There are no more Roswell Parks.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'll give it a second here to see if we have any other questions that come through. Otherwise, I'm seeing thank you, great presentation. So glad I stayed inside for this today.
Go outdoors now.
All right. Well, if nothing else is coming through, again, Cynthia, thank you so much for your time today and sharing this with us, and everyone who's on. We appreciate you. And I will try to get the recording up as soon as I can, but I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day.
Thanks. Go out and enjoy the sunshine. Thanks for joining.
All right. Oh, and one more quick thing. Thank you very much for an informative presentation. Can tell that Cynthia loves history. So good. All right.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.